Good evening, class. I come to you from rainy Florida this evening. It seems like we finally headed into winter. I'm so glad that we're finally at midterm time. That also means that we're preparing for our tribute speeches, and then next week we'll start preparing for persuasive speeches. We're really on a roll now as we get into this idea of delivering speeches online. You're doing some really good work. I want to keep encouraging you to discuss your speeches with each other through the discussion threads, to continue to evaluate yourselves and each other for how you can improve and for how you're doing things right. I'm continuing to evaluate your informative speeches and hope to have all that wrapped up within the next couple of days. Be patient as I take time to offer you constructive criticism back and ways that you can improve your speeches. And as I go through your outlines as well, those of you who continue to turn in outlines and papers and discussion threads. As far as what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about choosing that instructional material, what I promised I would talk to you about as far as some research techniques. We live in a time of vast material at our fingertips, but is all that material relevant? That's something we have to ask ourselves all the time. It's almost more difficult to jump into a vast sea of material than it would be when we had just a limited amount of material to wade through. So it's definitely good that we have such a vast amount of material, but at the same time it can be challenging to decide just what material and what types of material are appropriate for the things that we need to talk about and what is suitable for particular types of research and types of speeches that you'll present in an academic setting or in any other setting for that matter. We'll also talk tonight about the tribute speeches that you're going to submit an outline for this week. And you will complete a midterm. And you'll have at least 3 opportunities to go through that midterm. It's multiple choice, open book, and you'll have plenty of time. So don't stress yourself out about it. As long as you read your materials, the answers are right there in your text and should come very easily to you. So with all that said, let me just glance at my notes for a moment. And as far as choosing supporting materials, this really is a no-brainer for all of you have done research papers and submitted essays and worked either collaboratively or uniquely by yourselves on projects. The only way it differs in a speech is that I almost want you to think of being in a courtroom where a judge or a lawyer, a defense attorney, will call somebody up to the witness stand, and the very first thing they'll do is try to establish or to poke holes in somebody's credibility. And even as you are delivering a speech, everything that you say is being weighed for its credibility. So even the topic itself, if you are the best person to deliver that topic, that will be something that weighs in the minds of your listeners. Are you the best person? How can I illustrate that? If you get up and you are ready to deliver a speech on the finer points of chemical reactions within the Ecuadorian, and I'm going to draw a blank right there because that would be something I would not be delivering a speech on. I would probably pronounce most of the words incorrectly and would get so befuddled that I wouldn't even understand what to do. However, if someone asked me to deliver a speech on the finer points of speech writing or writing, for example, or writing for a publication or publishing news articles or using the internet or social media to your advantage, things would come very naturally to me, and I would be credible in those fields because not only would I speak with some expertise, I would be able to speak with ease, and I would be able to quote other people in those fields that would come very easily to me because these are people that I work with and I talk with. That's how it should be with your speeches. If you find yourself struggling very hard to find information, to present the information, then what you might consider is that your topic is actually probably a topic that is not the best one for you right off the bat. So that's where you actually begin, is your choice of topic and then your research. All material is not equal, as as I just alluded to. There's a vast sea of information out there. I used to tell my kids when we were at the grocery store, for instance, that consider the source, consider the source. When we would get up to the end cap by the register and there would be a National Enquirer or something like that, and they'd say, "Oh, Mom, is that for sure? Is that for real?" And I'd say, consider the source. Not everything, well, most of everything that is in the National Enquirer leaves little to be desired as far as truthfulness. Or there might be a grain of truth, but most of it would be stretching the truth. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, even in a library, the very first thing I would do with any book is I would, and I'm looking for one that's a good source, is I would check. Here's a good book by my friend Karen Kingsbury with Gary Smalley. Well, I happen to know both of those authors. Karen Kingsbury is a wonderful, inspirational Christian fiction writer. Gary Smalley happens to be a Christian counselor and psychologist. But say I didn't know who they were from Adam, didn't know their names, but I was just looking and I thought the book kind of looked interesting. Well, one of the first ways that we would discern whether the book was credible, the information was credible, or the book might be, in this case, because it's fiction, it might be well written and not full of errors, is we would look to see who published it, simply to see who, oh, it's Tyndale. We would look at the spine of the book and find out that Tyndale published it. Well, Tyndale is a very well-known publisher. Tyndale is not going to publish something that's full of grammatical errors, wrong syntax. It's not going to be laid out improperly on the page and difficult to read. So we would have some assurance. Well, what does this have to do with us? Well, some of your sources could come from books. I know that's a novel thought. Most of you probably don't go to the library or maybe to your own bookshelves and pull things off the shelf. Although, as you can see, I'm still a bit old-fashioned and I still like my books, but I also Google. I also use the internet. Matter of fact, it has saved my life. I can work so much more speedily now working off the internet. So I Google. Google is very intuitive now. I'll just add this very quickly. Google is intuitive now. If you haven't noticed, it's a lot easier to Google things. What I mean by Google being intuitive is Google actually anticipates answers to questions. So if you need some information like when was the first atomic bomb built, just type that in and it will probably give you several sources as to the answer. Or how should I write a paper? Or you just type in research paper and you might get a number of hits on how to write a research paper or things like that. But Google has become very intuitive. You can ask it questions, you can give it answers, and you'll get several leads as far as titles of things to look at. Now, how do you decide what are good sources from those leads? Well, number one, Google Analytics will kick up to the top of those what it considers the most credible sources. I don't know if you knew that. It's not just popularity, it's also credibility. And how does Google figure that out? Well, Google looks at a couple of things. It looks at how many people link to the sources, how many people put those links in their websites, in their blogs. That raises that source higher in Google. That's kind of interesting. Also, how many publications does that source contain within it? How often is it refreshed? How many people use that source? All of those things are considered and analyzed when Google spits out a source or it rises higher in Google. So you can kind of look through that. And then, of course, look at the source itself. Look at the URL or look at the source of where that, who is publishing that, what is it related to? Is it from University of Chicago, for instance, or is it an LA Times report, or is it the United States Census Bureau that's spitting out the information? Is it a PDF? Is it a website? All of those things can be legitimate sources, but make sure it is a legitimate source. You can also pull up something that's just somebody's blog. How legitimate is that? Well, I'm not sure. You might pull it up and you might see that somebody says that they're a pediatric nurse that specializes in whatever it is that you're looking up. Well, that could be legit. Are you going to take their word for it, though, that they're a pediatric nurse that studied at Johns Hopkins University? Well, maybe. Why don't you look their name up, though, and see if they come up somewhere else? See if you can verify that information on, say, a LinkedIn report or a number of other things that they've published. There are several ways that you can verify and look up information to make sure that you are citing in your speech, you're referring to credible information and a credible source. So information is extremely important. How credible the information is that you are delivering will confirm how credible your report is, your speech is. And so people will take you seriously if you report credible information. Now, that doesn't mean you just start spitting out a bunch of statistics from the United States Census Bureau from 1981. People don't like to hear a whole bunch of numbers in a speech. They might rather see a chart, as long as you produce a simple enough chart and let us focus on simple enough numbers to prove a point. But in a speech, especially in a short speech, you're not going to want to give out too many numbers. Okay, so I think I got through that whole page. Now let me look at this next page. And that's the other thing. When you're writing a speech, even if you've written it out, you've manuscripted out your speech, you're going to want to give yourself some notes so that you can kind of keep place and not have to just repeat your speech. Don't read your speech and just kind of go back to it and back to it and back to it. Give yourself some pointers to be able to talk to us, speak to us, not just read your speech and go back and forth. As far as organizing your points in your speech, creating your outline, go back to your research paper days in one aspect. That is for the organization of your materials. However, unlike your research paper, where you have chosen to start out with a catchy introduction and then go from point 1 to point 2 to point 3, your textbook has some great illustrations of how to organize your speech according to particular patterns that you might want to use. And other methods that keep the listener interested. So make sure that you do that. My suggestion on a speech is that, and one of the techniques that we talk about is grabbing the listener's attention right away. And one of the ways you can do that is to immediately pull that audience in through some kind of a story, being able to tell them a story. I hope to draw you in a very natural way. I didn't have to think a whole lot about it, but just by breaking the ice and maybe saying a little bit of something about the weather. Why do you think people very quickly off the cuff comment about the weather? Well, usually it's because it's something that we all have in common, and it puts us all on level playing ground. We can all talk about the weather. And so that's something, now I'm not saying to do that in your speech, but that's something that breaks the ice when we're just having a conversation, which is what we're doing now. I'm not presenting a formal speech. This is just a conversation. But organize your points. Maybe start out with a story. In talking about a tribute speech, you've got some great examples in your text of tribute speeches. Tribute speeches can be aimed at a person that you highly respect, that you're wanting to honor. Tribute speeches are often in the form of a eulogy. They can be about a parent. If it's not a eulogy, it can be about a parent, why you appreciate your mom or your dad, your grandmother, your grandfather. You're going to want to talk about in your introduction why that subject is significant or worthy of honor. In a tribute speech, more than anything, I think what you're wanting to do is to try to show and not tell why that person is worthy of the honor of the tribute, why you are going to recognize them and set them apart as a person that deserves to be honored. Okay, let me see if you can understand the difference between show and tell. My mother was a creative person. She was someone who I admired greatly. She was fun, bold, loving, and kind of bizarre sometimes. I really loved my mother, and so did my children. Now let me shift gears for a moment. I remember one day, my children told me a story about my mother, that one day she was visiting our home in Missouri, and she followed them to school to make sure they were safe. And my daughter had duty as a crossing guard, and she remembers standing on the corner talking to another crossing guard and seeing my mother walk up the hill towards the school. And she said that my mother she was on the other side of the street and she didn't see her. And she remembers the other little girl pointing at my mother and saying, "Oh, do you see that lady over there?" And my daughter kind of looked over and said, "Oh, yes." And the other little girl said, "Do you see her socks?" And my daughter said, "Yes." And the other little girl said, "They're rainbow socks. Oh my gosh, they're so cute." And my daughter just went. And as she was telling us the story later, she said, I never realized that other kids thought my grandma's rainbow socks were really cute. I was just really embarrassed. But she was the most just unique and creative and bright and kind of a little bit crazy maybe. Wonderful person. She was just grandma. And I don't even know. I feel so bad that I was embarrassed by her that day. But later on when I thought about it, I thought what I wouldn't give for a pair of rainbow socks. Okay. That's a true story, by the way. In the first instance, when I was telling you how creative and wonderful and how much I respected and loved my mother, that was telling you. In the second instance, I hope you were more interested. And I hope you got a fuller picture. I was showing you. I was trying to show you, and I was trying to leave you with some lasting idea, some image. I could have gone into much greater detail and so forth, and given you a visual, her dark hair and so forth and so on. But I think you get the point. Try to show us that person. Try to show us through a story about them, their good nature, something they did, an aspect of their character or a characteristic of their personality. That's really what we're looking for. Something they represent. 3 reasons, 7 reasons. I have attached a speech about President Reagan's a tribute to the Challenger, those who were lost in the Challenger accident, which, by the way, today is the anniversary of the Challenger accident in 1986. It's considered the epitome of a tribute speech. So it is in the learning activities folder, so look it up. The tribute speech is not considered an informative speech, but there should be information in it. So it's not primarily a speech where you go down and say, well, this person did this, and this person did that, and this person did this, and this person did that. There is some of that in there, but don't feel like the tribute speech has to be an exhaustive resume of the person's work. Look for an aspect that relates to a part of their life that you really want to focus on. And look for other examples in the appendix of your book, and look for other examples online of great tribute speeches. Look for the uniqueness of that person, not just, I love my dad, or I love my mom. Be able to say what it is about that person